April 1985. A loading dock behind a wholesale fish distribution warehouse on the southern edge of Atlanta, Georgia. A 1979 Chevrolet flatbed truck has just backed into bay number 4. The driver climbs down from the cab. She is 40 years old. Her name is Hazel Trigg. She's wearing rubber boots, a faded denim workshirt, and a Mississippi State University ball cap pulled low over her eyes. The trailer behind her truck holds 1,800 pounds of live channel catfish suspended in oxygenated water in a custom hauling tank. She built herself out of sheet steel in the equipment shed of her farm 17 months earlier. The receiving manager of the Atlanta Wholesale Fish Company walks out to meet her. He has been buying catfish from Mississippi suppliers for 12 years. He has never bought from a producer he had not personally vetted. He had never heard of Hazel Trigg before 3 weeks earlier. The check he will hand her at the end of the unloading will be for $7,200, the largest single check Hazel Trigg has earned in her life. But this story does not begin in Atlanta. This story begins 2 years earlier, on a Tuesday morning in March of 1983, at a Texaco filling station on Highway 49, just south of Indianola, Mississippi, when Hazel Trigg pulled up to pump number 3 with a borrowed cattle stock trailer hitched to the same Chevrolet flatbed and 400 pounds of live 3-inch channel catfish fingerlings sloshing in a 40-gallon plastic barrel in the bed. Hazel was 38 years old. She had been divorced for 14 months. She had an 8-year-old daughter named Sadie. She had a 56-acre farm on the south side of Sunflower County, Mississippi, that had legally been her ex-husband Curtis Trigg's farm until February of 1982, when the divorce settlement had transferred the land to her in exchange for her giving up her rights to Curtis's retirement account at the Cotton Gin, where he had worked for 16 years. The farm had a 4-acre pond on the western edge of the property. The pond had gone dry in the drought of 1980. It had stayed dry for 2.5 years, gathering only a thin film of rainwater every few months that evaporated within a week. Curtis Trigg, when he had still owned the farm, had told Hazel 3 different times between 1980 and 1981 that the pond was finished, that the spring underneath it had shifted, and that the only thing to do was to fill it in with bulldozer fill and convert the 4 acres back to row crop ground. Curtis had been wrong. Hazel had known he was wrong from the 2nd month of the drought, when she had walked the dry pond bed alone on a Sunday afternoon while Curtis watched a football game in the house, and she had found, in the deepest part of the basin, a small wet seam in the clay where water was still pushing up from below at a rate of roughly 1 cup per hour. The spring had not shifted. The spring had simply been overwhelmed by evaporation. The pond was not dead. The pond was waiting. Hazel had not told Curtis what she had found. Curtis had filed for divorce in March of 1981, 8 months later, citing irreconcilable differences, and a younger woman named Bonnie, who worked in the Cotton Gin office, and who Curtis would marry in October of 1982. Hazel had taken the farm in the settlement. She had taken the farmhouse. She had taken the 4-acre pond. She had spent the autumn of 1982 walking the pond bed every Saturday morning, watching the wet seam grow as the autumn rains returned, watching the basin slowly fill, watching the 4 acres of waiting water resume their existence. By February of 1983, the pond was full. By March of 1983, Hazel was driving to a fingerling supplier in Belzoni, Mississippi, with a borrowed cattle trailer in tow, to buy 400 pounds of 3-inch channel catfish fingerlings. She had paid $640 for the fingerlings. She had paid the money from a savings account she had built up between her divorce settlement and a part-time job she had taken at the Sunflower County Library in Indianola, 15 hours a week, $3.35 per hour. She had no other capital to invest in the operation. She had no degree in aquaculture. She had no formal training in fish farming. She had an 8-year-old daughter who was sleeping in the back seat of the truck with her head against the doorframe. She had a 4-acre pond that her ex-husband had told her was dead. She had 400 pounds of fingerlings in a plastic barrel in the bed. And she was about to pull into a Texaco station to top off the tank for the 17-mile drive home. The Texaco station at the corner of Highway 49 and County Road 18 had been operated by a family named the Holbrooks since 1958. The current owner was a 61-year-old man named Earl Holbrook, who knew everyone in the southern half of Sunflower County by name. Earl was at the cash register inside the station when Hazel pulled up to pump 3. 3 of his regular morning customers were on the bench in front of the station drinking coffee from styrofoam cups. The first was a 58-year-old cotton farmer named Wendell Ashmore, who had farmed 320 acres east of Indianola for 31 years. The second was a 53-year-old soybean and rice farmer named Buford Hollis, who had been Curtis Trigg's hunting partner for 10 years before the divorce and who had not spoken to Hazel since. The third was a 47-year-old retired veterinarian named Dr. Lawrence Pickett, who had treated cattle in the county for 22 years before retiring early due to a back injury, and who now spent his mornings on the bench at the Texaco. The 3 men watched Hazel get out of the truck. They watched her walk around to the bed and check the tarp covering the barrel. They watched her unscrew the gas cap and start pumping. The plastic barrel in the bed was sweating in the morning sun. Water was sloshing visibly against the sides. The fingerlings were generating a small but audible disturbance, a soft slapping sound as they swam against the inside of the barrel. Buford Hollis was the first to notice. Wendell Ashmore was the second. Dr. Pickett was the third. Buford set down his coffee cup. He stood up. He walked over to the truck. He looked into the bed. Hazel. Buford. He had not seen her in 11 months. He had not spoken to her in 14. He looked at the barrel. He looked at the small fingerlings visible just below the surface of the water. He looked at the cattle trailer hitched behind the truck, which was empty. Hazel, what in God's name are you doing? I am buying fingerlings. Buford squinted at the barrel. Catfish? Yes. He laughed. Not a long laugh. A short one. The kind of laugh a man gives in front of other men when he has just witnessed something that does not match any of the categories he was prepared to encounter at a Texaco station on a Tuesday morning. Wendell Ashmore stood up. He walked over. Hazel. Wendell. What is in the barrel? Catfish fingerlings. Where are you taking them? The pond on my place. Wendell looked at Buford. Buford looked at Wendell. They looked back at the barrel. Hazel, said Wendell carefully, the pond on your place has been dry since 1980. It is full again. We had not heard. I had not told anyone. There was a moment of quiet. Then Dr. Pickett, who had been a careful man in 22 years of veterinary practice, walked over from the bench. He looked into the bed. He looked at the fingerlings. Then he looked at Hazel. Mrs. Trigg, he said. Yes, Dr. Pickett. You understand that channel catfish need a stable thermal stratification in the pond, that they need oxygen levels above 5 parts per million during the summer growing season, that they will require commercial protein feed at approximately 3% of body weight per day, and that the recovery from a 2-year dry period will leave the pond ecology in an unstable state for the first 18 to 24 months. I understand all of those things, Dr. Pickett. He nodded slowly, the slowest nod a man can give. Then he stepped back from the truck. He did not laugh. He did not speak again. But Buford Hollis laughed, and Wendell Ashmore laughed, and Earl Holbrook, who had come out of the station to see what was happening, laughed when Buford explained it to him. The 3 men laughed for 45 seconds while Hazel finished pumping her gas. The laughs grew larger as the minutes passed, the way laughs grow when men in front of other men are reinforcing each other's certainty. Hazel did not respond. She finished pumping. She paid Earl inside the station. She walked back to the truck. She did not look at the men on the bench. She got in. Sadie was awake now in the back seat. She had been listening to the men through the window. Mama. Yes, Sadie. They were laughing at us. I know, honey. Why? Because they think the pond cannot grow catfish. Can it? Yes. Then why do they think it cannot? Because nobody else in the county has tried. Hazel started the truck. They drove away from the Texaco. By the end of that Tuesday afternoon, the story of Hazel Trigg buying 400 pounds of catfish for the dry pond was being told at the Indianola coffee shop, at the Cotton Gin office, at the John Deere dealership in Cleveland, and at the Friday evening fellowship dinner at the First Baptist Church of Indianola. The story took on the particular tone that Mississippi Delta communities reserve for divorced women who do unexpected things with property they have received in settlements. It was not a cruel tone. It was the tone of pity mixed with practical condescension. Bless her heart. She has been struggling since Curtis left. The pond went dry 3 years ago. Catfish need pond infrastructure that takes professional engineers and feed mills and trained workers. She is going to lose every fish in the pond by July. Curtis Trigg himself heard the story on Wednesday afternoon at the Cotton Gin. He was 41 by then. He was married to Bonnie. He had 2 months ago bought a new house in Cleveland, 12 miles north of Indianola. He listened to the story from a co-worker named Ray Tidwell, who told it the way men in cotton gins tell stories about ex-wives, which was with a small bitter satisfaction underneath the laughter. Curtis did not laugh. He had been married to Hazel for 13 years. He knew her. He knew the moment he heard the story that she had not bought 400 pounds of fingerlings on impulse. He knew she had been planning the operation for at least a year. He knew she had probably been studying the recovery of the pond for longer than that. He went home that evening, and he told Bonnie. Bonnie laughed. Bonnie laughed because she did not know Hazel, and because that was the response she thought Curtis was looking for. Curtis did not laugh with her. Curtis went out onto the back porch of the new Cleveland house, and he stood there for a long time in the gathering March dusk, and he thought about what Hazel might be doing. He did not say anything to Bonnie when he came back inside. He did not bring the subject up again. He had loved Hazel until he had stopped loving her, and he had not loved her again since the divorce. But he had never stopped respecting what she was capable of. The men who had laughed at the Texaco had not respected what she was capable of. They were about to begin the slow 3-year process of finding out. Hazel released the 400 pounds of channel catfish fingerlings into the 4-acre pond on the afternoon of March 14th, 1983. She did it alone, with Sadie sitting on the bank, watching. The way 8-year-olds watch their mothers. When the mother is doing something, the 8-year-old understands is important, without yet understanding why. Hazel had built, over the previous 4 months, a series of small infrastructure improvements at the pond. A floating aeration platform anchored at the deepest point. Powered by a 5-horsepower paddle wheel aerator she had bought used from a defunct catfish operation in Belzoni for $340. A small wooden feed dispensing dock on the eastern bank, where she could broadcast commercial catfish feed twice a day from a 50-pound bag stored in the pole barn. A simple wire fence around the pond perimeter at a height that would discourage but not prevent occasional waterfowl from accessing the surface. A water testing kit in a metal toolbox on the dock, capable of measuring dissolved oxygen, pH, ammonia, and nitrite levels, which Hazel had read about in a Mississippi State University Extension publication, and which she now ran twice a day, every day, at sunrise and at 5 in the afternoon. The total infrastructure investment, including the fingerlings, was approximately $1,640. Hazel had $2,200 remaining in the savings account. She would need every dollar of it across the next 18 months. The first 6 months were the hardest. Channel catfish fingerlings released into a recovering pond require careful management. Hazel lost approximately 11% of her stocking density in the first 30 days, which was within the normal range, but she did not yet know it was normal. She lost another 8% in months 2 and 3 to a combination of low-dissolved oxygen episodes during a hot June and a parasite outbreak that she diagnosed correctly only after consulting an extension agent at Mississippi State who drove down to the farm on a Saturday in July at no charge after Hazel had called him 3 times. The extension agent's name was Dr. Calvin Whitlock. He was 53. He had specialized in warm water aquaculture for 20 years. He had not in 20 years ever been called to consult on a 4-acre pond operation run by a single woman with no formal training. He spent 6 hours on the farm. He looked at Hazel's water testing log, which she had been keeping daily in a green spiral notebook. He looked at her feeding records, which were also daily. He looked at the sketch maps she had drawn of the pond bottom, with depth contours marked at 1-foot intervals based on a series of weighted line measurements she had made by herself over 4 Saturdays in February. He looked at her aeration schedule. He looked at her water exchange plan. "Mrs. Trigg," he said at the end of the consultation, "this is the cleanest small operation I have ever seen in this state. Most of the commercial operations in Sunflower County are not keeping records this good." Hazel did not respond to the compliment. She thanked him. She walked him to his truck. He left without charging her. He came back twice in 1984 and 3 times in 1985, always at no charge, always on his own initiative. He became, over the next 3 years, the second man in Sunflower County, besides her ex-husband Curtis, to fully understand what Hazel Trigg was building. By the autumn of 1983, the surviving catfish were averaging 3/4 of a pound per fish. The pond was holding stable water chemistry. Sadie, who was now 9, had memorized every step of the daily feeding routine and could broadcast feed from the dock as well as her mother could. Hazel had reduced her library shifts at the public library from 15 hours a week to 8, freeing up time for the morning feed. The operation was not yet profitable. The operation was not yet anything other than a 4-acre pond with surviving fish. But the surviving fish were approximately 17% of the total fingerling weight she had stocked 7 months earlier, which meant the operation was on track to produce approximately 7,000 pounds of harvest-ready catfish by the autumn of 1984, 15 months after stocking. At commercial pond bank prices of 70 cents per pound for live whole catfish, 7,000 pounds was approximately $4,900 in gross revenue against operating costs of approximately $100 to $800 across the year, for a net of $3,100. It was not a fortune. It was the first profit Hazel had earned from the farm in her life. The story at the Texaco filling station did not change in the autumn of 1983. The men on the bench continued to refer to her, when they referred to her at all, as the Trigg woman with the catfish problem. They did not know she had no catfish problem. They did not know the operation was running cleanly. They did not know that the pond was producing exactly as the Mississippi State Extension publications had predicted it would produce. They were not paying attention. The community in general was not paying attention. The community was paying attention to the cotton harvest, which was poor in 1983 due to an early frost. The community was paying attention to the row crop economy, which was weakening throughout 1983 and 1984 as farm gate prices for soybeans and corn fell below break-even for many Sunflower County operations. The community was paying attention to the foreclosures that were starting to ripple through the county banking system, the same way they were rippling through every farming community in the American South in 1984. The community was not paying attention to a recovering 4-acre pond on the south side of the county, owned by a divorced woman who had taken the property in a settlement and who had, against the advice of every man in her life, stocked it with channel catfish. By the spring of 1984, the cattle situation in the United States was beginning to shift in a way that nobody in Sunflower County yet understood. The American beef cattle industry, which had expanded rapidly through the 1970s in response to high beef prices, had entered a multi-year price collapse. Wholesale beef prices had fallen by approximately 23% between 1981 and 1983. By the spring of 1984, beef cattle producers across the South were beginning to liquidate herds at a loss because operating costs had stayed high while market prices had collapsed. The fast food chains and the institutional food service buyers, who had been the largest commercial customers of American beef throughout the 1970s, were beginning to look for protein alternatives. Channel catfish, which had been a small regional industry in 1979, had grown to a £200 million annual production industry by 1983, with most of that production coming from Mississippi, Arkansas, Louisiana, and Alabama. The catfish industry was on the verge of a major commercial breakthrough into the institutional protein market, and the breakthrough would happen in 1984 and 1985. Hazel Trigg did not know any of this in the autumn of 1983, when her catfish were averaging 3/4 pounds. She knew only that her pond was producing fish, and that she had a daughter to feed and a farm to keep. She did the work in front of her. She kept the records. She fed the fish twice a day. She took the water samples. She read every Mississippi State Extension publication she could find. By the spring of 1984, the surviving fish were averaging 1.5 pounds. Hazel did her first partial harvest in early June of 1984. She harvested approximately 1,100 pounds of catfish using a small seine net she had purchased at a wholesale supplier in Belzoni for $180 and the help of a 19-year-old farmhand named Demetrius Holloway, who had been working at neighboring farms during the summer harvest season since he was 14. Demetrius was the son of a single mother named Erlene Holloway, who lived in a rented farmhouse 2 miles east of Hazel's place. He had asked Hazel for work in May of 1984 because he had heard from Erlene that Mrs. Trigg's pond was producing fish and that she would soon need help. Hazel had hired him at $4.25 per hour, 50 cents above the minimum wage, on the condition that he learn every aspect of the operation rather than only doing the heavy work. Demetrius had agreed. He had worked 12 hours per week through the summer of 1984. By the end of the summer, he was running the morning water tests as well as Hazel was, and the partial harvest in June had been Demetrius pulling the seine while Hazel managed the holding tank on the truck. The 1,100 pounds from the June 1984 partial harvest were sold to a local processor in Belzoni at 68 cents per pound, for a total of $748. Hazel did a second partial harvest in late August of 1984, this time of approximately 1,400 pounds, sold at 72 cents per pound, for a total of $1,008. The full harvest was scheduled for late October. Hazel was projecting another 4,500 pounds at that harvest, for a final 1984 total of approximately 7,000 pounds. The total 1984 gross revenue from the catfish operation, projected, was approximately $4,800 to $5,000 against operating costs of approximately $2,400, for a net of approximately $2,500. It was a viable small farm enterprise. It was not yet a transformative one. The transformation began in October of 1984, but the news of it did not reach Hazel until February of 1985. In October of 1984, a Mississippi catfish industry trade group called the Catfish Farmers of America had finalized a major contract with a regional grocery chain headquartered in Memphis called Liberty Foods. The contract specified that Liberty Foods would purchase 8 million pounds of fresh whole-channel catfish in 1985, with delivery requirements that exceeded the production capacity of the 8 largest Mississippi operations combined. The deficit, the trade group members had quickly understood, would have to be filled by smaller producers across the 4-state catfish region. The trade group's pricing committee had set the wholesale price for 1985 institutional-grade catfish at $1.26 per pound, almost double what Hazel had been receiving from the local processor. Hazel did not learn about the Liberty Foods contract directly. She learned about it indirectly in February of 1985, when a fish wholesaler from Atlanta named Vernon Morrissey drove down to Sunflower County looking for backup suppliers to fill an order he had committed to that he could not fulfill on his existing supply chain. Vernon Morrissey was 49 years old. He had been in the wholesale fish distribution business for 23 years. He owned a company called Atlanta Wholesale Fish Company, which supplied approximately 70 mid-tier restaurants and 3 institutional food service buyers across metropolitan Atlanta. He had committed in November of 1984 to deliver approximately 60,000 pounds of fresh channel catfish to a regional school district contract starting in March of 1985. He had assumed his existing supply chain in Mississippi could handle the volume. By February of 1985, his existing supply chain had pulled their commitments because they had been absorbed into the Liberty Foods contract at higher prices. Vernon was looking, on short notice, for any small to mid-sized operation in Mississippi that could deliver 1,500 to 2,000 pounds per delivery cycle on a 6-week schedule. He had driven down to Belzoni first. He had asked a contact at the Belzoni processor whether there were any small producers in the area who were not already committed. The processor contact had hesitated. Then he had said, "There is a woman south of Indianola named Hazel Trigg. She has a 4-acre pond. She has been delivering us small loads since June of last year. She has clean fish. She is operating below capacity. I think she could probably handle what you need." Vernon Morrissey drove out to Hazel's farm on a cold Tuesday morning in February of 1985. He arrived without an appointment. He found Hazel in the equipment shed welding a section of sheet steel into what he later realized was the prototype of a custom hauling tank. Mrs. Trigg. Hazel set down the welding torch. She lifted the helmet. "Yes. My name is Vernon Morrissey. I am a wholesale fish distributor from Atlanta. I have an institutional contract starting in March that requires 1,500 to 2,000 pounds of fresh channel catfish per delivery on a 6-week cycle. My existing Mississippi suppliers have been absorbed into a larger contract and cannot fill my order. I have driven down here looking for small producers who might have available capacity. The Belzoni processor recommended you." Hazel was quiet for a moment. The Belzoni processor had been a good buyer, trustworthy. She had been moving small loads through him at 68 to 72 cents per pound for 9 months. She did the math in her head. Vernon Morrissey watched her. He was a careful man. He had bought from 140 different suppliers in his career. He knew, within 15 seconds of meeting Hazel, that the woman in the welding helmet was different from any catfish supplier he had ever worked with. "Mr. Morrissey, what are you offering?" $1.10 per pound, fresh, whole live, delivered to my Atlanta dock. 6-week delivery cycles starting March 15th. I will commit to 12 months of standing orders if your fish meet quality specifications on the first delivery. Hazel considered the math. $1.10 per pound was 56% higher than the 70 cents she had been getting locally. 2,000-pound deliveries every 6 weeks for 12 months would total roughly 17,000 pounds, gross revenue of approximately $18,700 across the contract year. "Mr. Morrissey, I need 3 days to consider this." "Take 3 days," said Vernon. He left his card on the workbench. He drove back to Atlanta. Hazel walked into the farmhouse that evening and sat at the kitchen table with the green spiral notebook in front of her. Sadie was now 10. Sadie had grown 3 inches in the past year. Sadie did her homework at the kitchen table every evening. Sadie watched her mother for a long moment. "Mama." "Yes, Sadie." "Was that man asking about the fish?" "He was." "What did he say?" "He wants to buy 2,000 pounds every 6 weeks for a year." Sadie was quiet for a moment. "That is a lot of fish." "It is. Can we do it?" Hazel looked at her 10-year-old daughter. She thought about the 4-acre pond outside. She thought about the production capacity she had been building for 22 months. She thought about Demetrius Holloway, who could probably move from 12 hours a week to 25 if she needed him. She thought about the savings account, which now held approximately $4,800. She thought about the welder in the equipment shed and the sheet steel and the prototype hauling tank she had been building for 3 weekends. "We can do it, Sadie." She called Vernon Morrissey 3 days later. She accepted the contract. The first delivery to Atlanta was scheduled for March 15th, 1985. Hazel and Demetrius spent the next 23 days finishing the custom hauling tank in the equipment shed. The tank was a sheet steel rectangular vessel mounted on the bed of the 1979 Chevrolet flatbed, with internal aeration powered by a battery-driven pump system and water capacity of 240 gallons. Hazel had designed it by combining specifications she had read in 3 different Mississippi state publications. She had welded it herself, with Demetrius assisting on the heavier sheets. The total cost of materials was $720. The first delivery to Atlanta in March of 1985 was 1,340 pounds of fresh channel catfish, averaging 2¼ pounds per fish, harvested at sunrise the morning of the delivery, transported in oxygenated water with a fish loss of only 6 fish out of approximately 800. Vernon Morrissey weighed the load at his Atlanta receiving dock. He paid Hazel $2,024 in a check at the loading bay. He told her the delivery exceeded his quality specifications. He extended the contract for an additional 6 months on the spot. The April 1985 delivery, which is the delivery that begins this script in the opening scene, was 2,100 pounds, valued at $2,310. The May 1985 delivery was 2,200 pounds, $2,420. By June of 1985, Hazel had delivered approximately 8,400 pounds of catfish to Atlanta and had grossed $9,200 across 4 deliveries. The community in Sunflower County was beginning, in the spring of 1985, to notice. The first sign of the community's noticing was the silence at the Texaco filling station. Buford Hollis, who had laughed at the truck bed in March of 1983, stopped laughing about Hazel Trigg in approximately April of 1985, when he heard from Earlene Holloway, who was Demetrius's mother and who lived 2 miles east of Hazel's place, that the Trigg pond was now producing 8 times the volume of any small operation in the county, and that an Atlanta wholesaler was paying significantly above market rate. Buford did not say anything in particular about it. He simply stopped telling the story. The second sign was the conversation that Wendell Ashmore had with Dr. Lawrence Pickett at the Texaco one Wednesday morning in May of 1985. Wendell was 60 by then. Dr. Pickett was 49. They were the same 2 men who had walked over to Hazel's truck in March of 1983. They were the same 2 men who had laughed for 45 seconds while she had pumped her gas. Wendell had been quiet for a few months. Dr. Pickett had been quiet since the original incident, having understood, even on that morning in 1983, that the woman with the catfish in the bed of the truck was going to do something the rest of them would not understand. Wendell, Lawrence, the Trigg woman. Yes, I owe her a conversation. I expect you do. So do you. I expect I do. They were quiet for a long time. They drank their coffee. Wendell finally said, "Do you remember what we said to her that morning?" "I remember every word," said Dr. Pickett. "We laughed at her." "We did. We had no business laughing at her." "We did not." Dr. Pickett took a slow drink of his coffee. He set the cup down. "The thing is, Wendell, I knew that morning. I knew before I walked over to that truck. I told her about thermal stratification and dissolved oxygen, and I knew the second I started talking that she had already done the reading. I could see it in her face. She did not need me to explain anything to her, and I laughed anyway." "So did I," said Wendell. Wendell drove out to Hazel's farm that Saturday morning. He arrived without an appointment, the way Vernon Morrissey had arrived 3 months earlier. He stood in the driveway for 10 minutes before Hazel came out of the farmhouse. "Mrs. Trigg, Wendell." Wendell took off his cap. He held it in his hands. He looked past her toward the pond, which was visible from the driveway through a stand of pecan trees. He did not say anything for a long moment. Then he said, "Mrs. Trigg, I drove here this morning to apologize for what I did at the Texaco in March of 1983. The thing about laughing at the fingerlings in the back of your truck. I do not want to soften it or qualify it. I want to apologize. I had no business laughing. I knew it then. I have known it more clearly every month since." Hazel was quiet for a long moment. She had not been expecting Wendell at her driveway. She had not been expecting an apology. She did not know what to do with the apology exactly, but she also did not need to know what to do with it. She nodded. She said, "Wendell, you did not have to drive out here. I had to drive out here." He paused. "Hazel, can I ask you a question?" "Yes." "Where did you learn this?" Hazel looked at him for a moment. She did not need to answer the question. She had not, in fact, told the story of where she had learned it to anyone, including her ex-husband Curtis, when they had still been married, including the extension agent Dr. Whitlock when he had asked, including Vernon Morrissey when she had signed the contract. She had read 3 Mississippi state publications and a stack of journal articles she had borrowed by interlibrary loan from the University of Mississippi library system. She had calculated her own pond depth contours. She had built her own infrastructure. She had figured out the parasites by trial and error. She had not had a mentor. She had not had a tradition behind her. She had not inherited the operation from anyone. She had simply needed an income stream after the divorce, and she had looked at the 4-acre pond on the property she had taken in the settlement, and she had reasoned her way from there to a viable small commercial catfish operation across 22 months of careful work. She did not want to tell Wendell Ashmore the truth, exactly, because the truth was a kind of private answer. She also did not want to lie. So she gave him a partial answer. "I read the Mississippi State Extension publications, Wendell. I tested the water every morning at sunrise for 2.5 years. The fish told me what they needed." Wendell nodded. He understood the answer was incomplete. He also understood it was complete enough. He thanked her. He drove home. He did not mention the conversation to Buford Hollis or to anyone else at the Texaco. He simply stopped participating in any conversation in which the catfish operation was discussed dismissively. Dr. Lawrence Pickett never apologized in person. He could not bring himself to. He died in 1992 of a heart attack at age 56. His wife, Mary Ann, when she was cleaning out his desk after his death, found a sealed envelope addressed to Hazel Trigg in his handwriting. She drove the envelope to Hazel's farm a week after the funeral. The envelope contained a 1-page letter dated March 1985, 2 months after the Atlanta contract had begun, that Dr. Pickett had written, but never mailed. The letter read, "Mrs. Trigg, I owe you an apology that I am not yet able to deliver in person. I knew that morning at the Texaco that you knew exactly what you were doing. I laughed because the men around me were laughing. That is the only honest reason I have. I have been ashamed of it for 2 years. I have driven past your pond 4 times in the last 6 months. The work you have done is more careful than any commercial catfish operation in this county. I want you to know that I know that. I want you to know that the laugh was the worst thing I have done in my professional life, and that I have not laughed at any other woman doing serious work since that morning. Dr. Lawrence Pickett." Hazel read the letter twice. She did not respond, because there was no one to respond to. She kept the letter in the green spiral notebook in the kitchen drawer. By the autumn of 1985, the Trigg catfish operation was producing approximately £28,000 per year. Hazel had taken on a second 4-acre pond that she had leased from a neighbor named Earl Hadley for $180 per year. She had hired Demetrius Holloway full-time at $7.50 per hour. She had purchased a used commercial-grade aerator for the second pond. She had upgraded the custom hauling tank to a 400-gallon capacity. The Atlanta contract continued through 1986, then expanded in 1987 when Vernon Morrissey added 2 additional restaurant clients to his Atlanta route. By 1988, Hazel was supplying approximately £52,000 annually to Vernon's distribution network at an average price of 1.18 per pound. By 1990, she was supplying £84,000 annually at 1.32 per pound. The catfish operation was no longer a small farm sideline. It was a commercial enterprise generating, by 1990, approximately $111,000 in annual gross revenue. The farm itself, the 56-acre property that Hazel had received in the divorce settlement in 1982, had been completely converted to aquaculture by 1990. The 4-acre pond from 1983 had been expanded to 6 acres. 2 additional ponds had been excavated on the eastern part of the property in 1987 and 1988. The total water surface area was now 18 acres. The annual production was approaching £100,000. Hazel was 45 in 1990. She had a 15-year-old daughter, Sadie, who could now run the entire morning water testing routine and who could handle the harvest seine as well as any commercial operator in the county. Demetrius Holloway had taken over operational management in 1989 and was earning $42,000 per year as the operations general manager. Curtis Trigg, who had divorced Hazel in 1982, had divorced Bonnie in 1989 and had remained single since. He had quit the cotton gin in 1991 and had started a small carpentry business out of a shed behind the rented house he had moved into after the second divorce. He had not spoken to Hazel since their own divorce in 1982. He had not, in 9 years, reached out. In June of 1991, Curtis drove out to Hazel's farm without warning. He pulled into the gravel driveway at 4 in the afternoon on a Saturday. He sat in the truck for 15 minutes. Hazel saw him from the kitchen window. She did not go out. She waited. Eventually, Curtis got out of the truck. He walked to the porch. He knocked. Hazel opened the door. Curtis. Hazel. He had aged. He was 49. He was thinner than she remembered. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with physical work. Hazel, can I have 10 minutes? She let him in. They sat in the living room. He did not take the coffee she offered. He looked at her for a long time before speaking. Hazel, I owe you an apology. I am not here to ask for anything. I am not here to be friends again. I am not here to talk about Sadie, although I would like to see her if she would let me. I am here only to apologize. I knew when you bought those fingerlings in March of 1983 that you were doing exactly what you said you were doing. I knew that the pond was not dead. I knew that the spring under it had not shifted. I had spent 3 Saturdays in 1981 watching that pond myself. I knew the recovery was happening. I told you it was finished because I wanted it to be finished. I wanted you to give up on the property. I wanted the divorce settlement to take everything from you because I wanted the punishment that comes with separating myself from a woman like you. I have spent 9 years thinking about what I told you about that pond. I have spent 9 years knowing that I lied. I am sitting in your living room today because I do not want to die without saying it out loud. I lied about the pond, Hazel. I lied about a great many things. I am sorry. The thing you have built on this land in the years since I left is what you would have built with me too if I had been a different kind of man. Hazel was quiet for a long time. She had not expected Curtis to apologize. She had assumed, somewhere in the 2nd year of the operation, that Curtis had probably known the pond was viable. She had filed that knowledge away the way a woman files away knowledge of a husband's many small dishonesties. She had not been waiting for the apology, but she had also not been pretending the dishonesty had not existed. Curtis. Yes, Hazel. Thank you for saying it. I do not need anything from you. I do not need this conversation to continue. Sadie will see you when she is ready, and you will need to wait for that decision to be hers. The pond was always going to come back. I knew that the year you told me it was finished. We both lied to each other for 13 years before we admitted it. I forgive you for the pond. I do not yet forgive you for the rest, but I am willing to be in the same room with you again when Sadie wants me to be." Curtis nodded. He stood up. He walked to the door. He turned at the door, and he said, "The operation looks good, Hazel. It is the best thing in this county. I am proud of you for it. I have no right to be proud, but I am." Hazel did not respond to that. She watched Curtis walk to his truck. She watched him drive away. She did not cry. She had finished crying about Curtis Trigg in 1982. She walked back to the kitchen. She looked at the green spiral notebook on the table, the same notebook she had been keeping since March of 1983. She turned to the next blank page. She wrote, "Curtis came today, apologized for the pond." She closed the notebook. She went outside to walk the eastern banks, where the second pond was just beginning the morning stratification cycle, and the sun was hitting the water at the angle it hits in late June afternoons in the Mississippi Delta, and the catfish were rising and breaking the surface in the slow rhythmic pattern that meant the operation was running exactly as she had built it to run. Hazel Trigg continued to operate the farm through 2014. By that year, she was 69 years old. The operation had grown to 42 acres of pond surface area, employed 11 people, and was producing approximately 380,000 pounds of catfish annually. Demetrius Holloway had been her general manager for 25 years. Sadie Trigg, who was 39 by then, had taken over daily operations management in 2010 after returning to Sunflower County from a 15-year career in agricultural extension work in Tennessee and Alabama. The operation was now legally registered as Trigg Family Aquaculture, with Sadie listed as the primary operator and Hazel as the founding partner. Sadie had married a Mississippi State University aquaculture professor named David Whitlock in 2002. David Whitlock was the son of Dr. Calvin Whitlock, the extension agent who had driven down to consult with Hazel in July of 1983. David and Sadie had 2 children, a son named Curtis Whitlock Trigg, born in 2005, and a daughter named Hazel Whitlock Trigg, born in 2008. The grandson, Curtis, was 19 in 2024. The granddaughter, Hazel, was 16. Both children had been raised on the farm. Both had been working the morning water tests since they were old enough to read the test kit colorimetric strips. Hazel Trigg, the elder Hazel, who had started the operation in March of 1983 with 400 pounds of fingerlings and a borrowed cattle trailer, walked the eastern banks of the original 4-acre pond every morning at 5:30 until the spring of 2024. She walked them sometimes with her granddaughter Hazel, sometimes alone, always with the same cup of black coffee she had carried out to the pond every morning for 41 years. She did not give interviews. She had been asked many times by Mississippi agricultural publications and by one regional television station to tell the story of how she had built the operation. She had declined each time. She did not believe the story was useful in the form a publication would want it. The publications would want the moment of decision, the moment of vindication, the moment when the men who had laughed at her had been forced to acknowledge their wrongness. Those moments existed in Hazel's history. But the moments that mattered were not those moments. The moments that mattered were the daily moments. The 5:30 morning water tests on April mornings when the water temperature was 64 degrees and the dissolved oxygen was holding at 6.2 parts per million. The afternoon feed broadcasts at 5 o'clock when the catfish would gather at the dock the way catfish gather. The Saturday afternoons when Sadie was 11 and they had cleaned out the seine net together at the equipment shed sink. The Tuesday morning in July of 1983 when Dr. Calvin Whitlock had walked the pond with her for 6 hours and had told her, at the end of the consultation, that she was running the cleanest small operation he had ever seen. The Friday in March of 1985 when Vernon Morrissey had walked into her equipment shed and had asked if she could deliver 1,500 pounds every 6 weeks. Those were the moments that mattered. The vindication moments that came later were only the public visible records of a private invisible work that had been happening every single day at the pond for almost half a century. Sadie, who is now 50 in 2025, sits sometimes at the same kitchen table where her mother had sat with the green spiral notebook in 1983, where her mother had written the entry about Curtis's apology in 1991, where her mother had kept the unmailed letter from Dr. Lawrence Pickett. Sadie has the green spiral notebook in front of her on those evenings. She reads through her mother's entries. She has read them dozens of times. She still finds new things in them. She finds, for example, that her mother had written down, in March of 1983, the exact number of fingerlings she had purchased, the exact pH of the pond water on the morning of stocking, and the exact weight of feed she had broadcast on the first afternoon. Her mother had kept these records every day for 41 years. The records fill 73 notebooks now, stored in a wooden cabinet in the office of the equipment shed that her mother had welded the first hauling tank in. The lesson that Hazel Trigg passed to her daughter Sadie, and that Sadie has been passing to her own daughter Hazel and her son Curtis, has not been about catfish. It has not been about the pond. It has not been about the operation. It has been about something more ordinary and more difficult. The lesson has been about the morning water tests. The lesson has been about the daily 5:30 walk to the eastern bank. The lesson has been about the green spiral notebook and the discipline of writing the day's observations in it before going to bed. The lesson has been that the work, when it is done correctly and continuously, will produce its own result, and that the result does not need to be defended against the men at the Texaco filling station, because the work will eventually arrive at the men's own door in the form of fish in the pond, in the form of contracts from Atlanta, in the form of the apology that Curtis Trigg drove out to deliver in June of 1991, in the form of the unopened letter from Dr. Lawrence Pickett that arrived in Hazel's hands in 1992. The work arrives. The men who laughed do not have to be answered. The work answers them. That has been the lesson, and Hazel Trigg gave it to Sadie, not in a speech, not in an interview, not even in a single conversation, but in 41 consecutive years of walking out to the eastern bank of a 4-acre pond at 5:30 every morning with a cup of black coffee in her hand, while the rest of Sunflower County continued, as Sunflower County had always continued, to laugh at the things it did not understand.